Hello and welcome to the F1 Chicane episode 1. My name is Second Heart and this is my new F1 show where today's episode we're going to be looking at the 5 major storylines as promised in the introductory episode. The 5 major storylines that we should be keeping an eye on in the upcoming 2021 F1 season. And the first one I'm rather optimistic about. The first major storyline that I want to look at is the one that I'm actually really rather optimistic about. Yeah, it is the championship. Looks like we might actually get a championship fight on our hands. Preseason testing showed that Mercedes are vulnerable, I guess. There's only so much, of course, that we can read into preseason testing, and sandbagging, I suppose, is the key word there. But Mercedes looked vulnerable in a way that they haven't for a long time. They had issues in the 2019 preseason testing, and then they showed up to Australia and they comfortably won that race. But this time, there is a worthy challenger in Red Bull who looked very comfortable that day in 2019. Ferrari were supposed to be the big challengers, and they ended up coming fourth and fifth. Red Bull ended up taking third that day, but they were never as close in 2019 to Mercedes as Ferrari were, and in 2021 it looks like maybe Red Bull have caught up to Mercedes. They've got Sergio Perez in now to replace Alexander Albon, who was a disappointing understudy to Max Verstappen, who is the main man at Red Bull for sure and is the likely challenger. But we might actually see a fight for the Constructors' Championship as well. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Mercedes will win both championships. I do still think Lewis Hamilton is the man to beat in terms of the Drivers' Championship, but Valtteri Bottas's poor form last year and inconsistency in the last few years, I think, could be a battleground for Red Bull in terms of, getting second and third in a race that Lewis Hamilton wins, or getting first and third in the odd race. Sergio Perez is an incredibly experienced driver. He's now a race-winning driver, getting his first victory in Sakir last year for the Racing Point. He got fourth in the championship last year, as high as he's ever been. Probably now he is in the form of his career. He's been in Formula One since 2011. This is his first real chance at a championship contending car, and he's not going to let that go. This is something he's waited for a long time, and he's gonna want to take that opportunity. The Red Bull looked very good in testing. He looked comfortable in the car. Verstappen looked comfortable in the car. Like, that was an issue last year where Albon was spinning. He was looking uneasy. He didn't seem to fit right with the car. Max as well even looked to be struggling at times, but was still just extracting the absolute maximum out of the vehicle. But this year in testing, both of them they looked at home in the cockpit of their car, and the pace of the car looked good too. So they looked reliable. They set the second most amount of laps, I think, of any team. Verstappen and Perez both did lap after lap. They were both very quick. Lap times, there's only so much you can read into them in preseason testing, but they both looked quick and they looked promising. And at the same time, both Mercedes drivers were complaining about how uncomfortable they were in the car. So there's kind of a role reversal there. It's unlikely that they would lie about that as a form of mind games, as a form of sandbagging. I think that's maybe a step too far. I think that's maybe a bit ridiculous. Like, that's almost detrimental to the team because, testing is about gathering data, getting comfortable with the car, getting to know the car, getting to know its weaknesses and its strengths. And I think Mercedes certainly found out its weaknesses. It looked unstable. Hamilton looked uncomfortable. We saw he went off in the gravel on day 2. He spun as well before he was starting a lap. Bottas had reliability issues, a gearbox problem. Aston Martin, a team that Mercedes supply parts to, including their engine and their gearbox, both of those components had reliability issues as well. So, there's cracks in the Mercedes team just appearing, and it's possible that they turn up at Bahrain and they're still quickest, and honestly that's probably the most likely outcome. But Red Bull look as close as they've ever been to Mercedes, and hopefully we get a championship fight and we go to Brazil or Saudi Arabia or Abu Dhabi, and we get a fight for the championship, because really Formula One needs that in what is the final year of these regulations. The second storyline that I want to look at is the development of those 2022 cars, and I like to call it development ditching in a way, because at a certain point, every team who has a 2021 car will have to completely give up on improving that car, because the focus on the 2022 cars is so important. New regulations is a chance to wipe the slate clean. It's a good chance to reset the team and to move up the constructors table, and get closer to the ability to fight for race wins. You're looking at Alpine and Ferrari and McLaren. They're the teams that if they have a good uh, if they have a good development season for 2022, if they develop their car really well and make use of the new regulations and the cost caps that are coming in, then they could be competing with Mercedes and Red Bull for race wins. And most importantly, if there is to be a championship fight this year, then perhaps a focus of attention will be drawn on those 2021 cars, and they, in an effort to win the championship, will maybe have to lose ground in the 2022 championship battle. So there's such a difficulty there in knowing when to switch over and start looking at the 2022 car. First of all, there's Haas, who've already begun that process, who've basically said we're giving up on the current car. We can't afford to keep up. We can't afford to compete with the big guys. We're struggling at the back of the grid. In 2022, with these new cost caps coming in, with the greater aero design that's supposed to remove dirty air almost completely from the cars, it is a great chance for them to move up the grid, to be able to compete for points and maybe even podiums if they absolutely nail it. Because that is a team that is struggling, and in that sense, you would fear for their 2021 season. They will likely come last. They will be competing with Williams for the majority of the season, but the long term benefits may be that they are quicker in 2022. And now, as we reach the likes of, say, Silverstone and Hungary and Spa, when we get to those races, teams will have to, at a point, give up working on the 2021 cars, because teams still want to be competitive this year. Teams want to pick up podiums. They want to pick up points. It is a risk, and it is a big risk of when to seize development basically on the entire 2021 program. So if you're McLaren, say, and you're third in the championship, you're defending that third place. It's really important for you, the team, to get the prize money to come third. But there's 10 races to go. Alpine are looking quick. Ferrari are looking quick. Do you develop the car? Do you continue to develop the car to stay ahead of those two teams, or do you essentially cede control of the championship to those teams, and Aston Martin as well, in order to get a head start on the 2022 car? So I think that's going to be a really big storyline for us this year. One that I think we'll see a lot of talk about from all the teams. They're going to be very coy. They're going to want to reveal as little as they can. But at the same time, we will reach a certain point. Like, we will likely get to Singapore if we have that race, or Japan if we have that race, and we'll have teams being like, yeah, we've shown up with no upgrades and we're shifting focus on the 2022 car. Like, it's at that stage of the season where we will probably see the majority of the teams make that admission. Some teams might even, as we get to Imola, the third race of the season, maybe Ferrari will come out and say we're focusing on 2022. It's an interesting game of cat and mouse, and where teams kind of think they can take the risks without really losing the reward. And yeah, it's gonna be really interesting to see how teams manage that, because the precedent. I don't want to say precedent, but a great example of this is in 2008. And this is what I mean when I say Red Bull and Mercedes could get caught up in a championship battle. Is in 2008, McLaren and Ferrari were caught in a championship battle between Lewis Hamilton and Felipe Massa, and then they were developing the car to win that championship. And then come 2009, both cars were at the back of the grid because the other teams all got a head start. Red Bull focused on the 2009 car. There's also stuff with Braun as well, of course, but there were other teams as well. Toyota had a good start to 2009, so it's going to be interesting to see. And if it kneecaps Mercedes and Red Bull in a way, if they get into a championship fight, that the short term gain of a championship fight ends up resulting in a poor 2022 season start. So that is such an interesting balance that we're going to have to watch out for, and a huge storyline going into the next season. The third major storyline that I want to look at for this year is the midfield shakeup. There's a lot of drivers have moved around in the silly season carousel of 2020. The first one that kind of started the domino effect was Sebastian Vettel leaving Ferrari after joining there in 2015 after almost winning a championship or two there. The relationship clearly had broken down by the end, and it was a pretty harsh breakup for a finish. Charles Leclerc, now the idol of Ferrari, he's moved to Aston Martin. Sebastian Vettel, a four-time world champion, of course. Aston Martin came fourth in the Constructors' Championship under the name of Racing Point. Sergio Perez came fourth for them in the driver standings as well. He beat out Lance Stroll, who will be Vettel's new teammate in the teammate battle in 2020. So how Vettel copes there will be interesting. Moving to a new team is always difficult for drivers because it's a new engine, it's a new car, drives completely differently to the old one. It'll be interesting to see how Vettel does with a Mercedes engine. He's been with Red Bull and Ferrari up to now, so a Mercedes engine for him now as well. That will be an interesting side story as well in this, and how he compares the Mercedes and the Ferrari engine power units. So that will be interesting as well. He struggled in 2018, 2019, and 2020 especially with that Ferrari. He was in the championship battle in 2018, but by the end it just became a little sad. He would just spin. He would crash into cars. He was in very poor form by the end of 2018. 2019 again, he picked up a race win in Singapore. He picked up a few podiums here and there, but he was outshined by his new teammate in Charles Leclerc, his new young teammate in Charles Leclerc. So he has a point to prove in a way. This could make or break his legacy in the sport as well. If he struggles and loses to Lance Stroll, that would be very damaging to his legacy in the sport. So in a way, this next year or two for him and Aston Martin is make or break for Sebastian Vettel. And I think it's also make or break for Esteban Ocon, who's going up now against Fernando Alonso, who's returned to sport after 2 years away. He left McLaren at the end of 2018, and he took a 2-year break from the sport. He continued to participate in motorsport, but not in Formula One. He would race in IndyCar and NASCAR. Well, I don't think he actually did NASCAR, but IndyCar and the like, WEC as well, endurance racing. So he's not new to a Formula One seat, that's for sure. And of course, he's a 2-time world champion himself. He had a biking accident a month ago. He's racing with metal plates in his jaw, which must be uncomfortable. But at preseason testing, he looked as good as ever. He was, doing as many laps as anyone else. He looked quick as well again. When we talk about development ditching, I think Alpine might actually be one of the first teams to ditch development of their 2021 car in favor of 2022. And having Fernando Alonso, I think, will be a major reason why. This is a team, they've put a lot of money into bringing Alonso into the team, rebranding the team name to Alpine, a sub-brand of Renault that they owned since the 70s and 80s, I think. That might be wrong. But, Alpine is a brand of Renault. They've gotten rid of Cyril Abiteboul. They've brought in new men to take charge of the team who've got experience of winning in MotoGP, David Brivio. So, Alpine, I don't think they'll be that interesting this year, but I think the inter-team battle will be quite interesting, because for Esteban Ocon, this is a guy who, was looking at the Mercedes seat not that long ago, and now he lost the teammate battle to Daniel Ricciardo, but there's allowances given to the fact that he himself had a year break from the sport, and he doesn't have the same experience that Alonso has to get back into that same groove. By the end of the year, he was starting to compete better with his Australian teammate, but also Ricciardo was starting to focus on moving to McLaren. So, I think this is a make or break year for Ocon's career. If he loses in a Van Dorn-esque way to Alonso, in which case, loses every qualifying battle, gets completely outscored in the points, then that could end his F1 career. The Alpine might look elsewhere for a new name for the team. But if he can compete, if he can be on the same level or even do better than Alonso, I think that will reflect very well for him. And he might not quite get into the Mercedes seat for 2022, but it would line him up for a decent F1 career at the very least. He got his first podium in Sakir as well, and how he shapes up against the Spaniard will be quite interesting. Then aside from that, of course, the seat opened up at Alpine because Daniel Ricciardo left for McLaren. The seat opened up at McLaren because Carlos Sainz left for Ferrari, taking over from Sebastian Vettel. The two of them were battling in the midfield quite a lot for the last 2 years. Carlos Sainz proved himself to be a consistent driver, a very quick driver, someone who's very capable behind the wheel, someone who's good in race trim, who's quick in qualifying. He's a decent overall package. He's a quality 4 out of 5 driver. He can do everything quite well. He's not quite had those spectacular drives. There was Brazil 2019 where he came from last onto the podium, but that was a bit fortuitous in a way. Although he did very well to take control of the opportunity when it arose. He got on the podium last year in Monza, and he had a great 2 years at McLaren, and he is ready for the step up to Ferrari, I think. And I think that he will compete against Charles Leclerc. I don't think he's quite as quick as Leclerc, but again, seeing how those two compete against each other, I think will be a very interesting story for this year. And then Daniel Ricciardo going into McLaren, who are now, of course, McLaren Mercedes. The return of the great championship winning combination of the early and mid 2000s. Daniel Ricciardo's a proven race winner. He got a few podiums with Renault last season. He's, again, a quality driver. He, again, is someone who's good at everything. He maybe not quite, his qualifying pace isn't quite there, but race pace is phenomenal. He's one of the best racers out there. He's got the best racecraft of almost anyone on the grid, and that could be more important than how good he is in qualifying. And again, this is another marker for Lando Norris. He competed. He didn't quite compete with Carlos Sainz in the first season, but in his second season in F1 he did. He was very level with his teammate, and his teammate got a drive to Ferrari. Carlos Sainz is highly regarded among the paddock, so Lando Norris was able to compete with him. And much the same way that we can kind of compare Sebastian Vettel and Sergio Perez, I think we'll be able to compare Carlos Sainz with Daniel Ricciardo in an interesting way this year, and that by extension will be able to compare Lando Norris to both of them. And I think there's a lot of rich story there. Of course, Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris they'll be dubbed the banter boys by the F1 Chicane program. They're the nutters of the grid. They're the drivers who are good crack, and now they're teammates together. So that will be another fun storyline for us this year. And I think overall the midfield shakeup is exciting as any midfield shakeup as we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years in F1. So I think that's going to be a huge storyline for us this year. The penultimate point that I want to look at is, by extension, silly season for the next year. There's, I've already touched on this a little, so we'll make it quick. There's the two Mercedes drivers are both out of contract at the end of the year. Do Mercedes stick with Bottas? Does Hamilton retire? That's a legitimate question for this year. We could bow out with an 8th championship, and that would make him the most successful F1 driver of all time. That's as good a reason as any to bow out from the sport. Especially heading into new regulations where the standing order of things might change, and he might end up at the back of the grid or in the midfield in 2022. And does Hamilton want to do that? So that will be a really big storyline. Who replaces either of those drivers if they are to leave? George Russell, of course, also out of contract at Williams, who we expect to be at the back of the grid. George Russell proved insecure when he subbed in for a sick Hamilton. He's good enough to compete against Bottas. He comfortably outperformed the Finn in that race, who has much greater experience in both the sport and in that Mercedes car. So that was a humiliating weekend for Bottas at the hands of Russell, who was very, very unlucky not to win that race, having led for the majority of the laps. There's also Esteban Ocon, as I mentioned. If he does perform poorly against Fernando Alonso, then maybe they will look to bring in maybe Pierre Gasly, who is at AlphaTauri still, who looks unlikely to ever go back to Red Bull after the failed stint that he had there in 2019. He's French. I think a lot of people have made that connection, and I think that connection makes sense. He's a race winner now, of course. He had a great comeback year in 2020. Of course, he had that podium at the end of 2019 as well, when he switched back to Toro Rosso. So I think that's another thing that we have to keep an eye out as well. Sergio Perez is also out of contract. He's only given a 1 year deal with Red Bull. So there's also Yuki Tsunoda, who's coming into AlphaTauri, debuting there. How he competes against Gasly will be interesting as well. Then there's, Helmut Marko, who's very, very excited by the prospect of Tsunoda, who looked very good in testing, was second quickest on the final day. Albeit, again, testing times don't matter too much, but could he be thrust into the number one team immediately into the 2022 season? So that's going to be another wrinkle to the storyline as well with the championship, because if Sergio Perez doesn't compete alongside Max Verstappen, if he doesn't compete against Valtteri Bottas, and meanwhile Yuki Tsunoda's picking up 5th, 6th, and 7th places in an AlphaTauri, I think that would be reason enough to bring the Japanese driver into Red Bull, and that would be again another really interesting storyline for Red Bull, who would be promoting a third young driver at a very early stage in their career, actually 4th, I guess, if you include Max Verstappen. 2 of them failed, one of them is Max Verstappen, so that's another storyline for us to keep an eye out this year, and I think we could be in store for another really silly season. And then finally, the last storyline that we have to look at is nothing to do with any of the drivers per se, nothing really to do with any of the cars, but is to do with the sprint race formula that Ross Brawn has proposed for the Silverstone, Monza and Interlagos races in England and Italy and Brazil respectively. That would mean that we would have a free practice 1 session that is an hour long on Friday. We would have a qualifying session on Friday after that. Then on Saturday we would have a free practice 2. Then we would have a 45-minute to an hour-long sprint race, for which we don't fully know the nooks and crannies of how that would work. But the result of that sprint race would then set the grade for the actual race that will take place on Sunday. The first place driver at the end of the sprint race will also receive 3 points in the driver standings. Second place will get 2 points, and third place will receive 1 point. So in effect, the sprint races, they could decide the championship. In theory, we could get to Brazil, which is the anti-penultimate race of the season, and Hamilton might pick up 3 points, and that might be enough to seal the championship. And then we go into a race on Sunday, and suddenly there's nothing to play for in the championship. So, it's an idea that they're pushing forward. It's an idea that none of the drivers seem particularly happy with. George Russell came out and said that they should just be patient and see how the new regulations do next year. It does kind of smack of a desperation to change up the order of things. It doesn't seem very thought through, because the problem with the grid at the moment is that it's very difficult to race, so including more racing just doesn't square up as a solution to this problem that they have. But the new regulations in 2022 do seem to square up to the problems that need fixing in Formula 1, because it's by no means a perfect sport. The other thing that's come up is Ross Brawn has said, it's a great opportunity for F1 to be in the sporting headlines on a Friday, on a Saturday, and on a Sunday. And he's right. This would draw eyes to the sport. I think, anytime F1 tries out a new format, it draws people back in, because it's always interesting to see, how new ideas actually pan out on. We can talk about all we like in videos and on paper, but actually putting it to the test is the only way we'll truly know how it gets on. And I suppose that's really the big argument for doing this. Of course, this idea initially started with the idea of doing reverse grid sprint races, where the teams that say, the idea that it would work in my head is, at least, is say Lewis Hamilton won the previous race, he would then start the sprint race at the back of the grid, and he would have 45 minutes to an hour to overtake as many as he could, and the final standings at the end of that sprint race would decide the grade for Sunday, and then we would have a normal race. And I think that would have been an interesting idea. I think that could have been something that really shakes up Formula 1 and really makes things a bit more competitive. And Martin Brundle has always made the point that doing that wouldn't decide the championship. It would maybe just extend the battle a race or two. So he still thinks the best drivers would win, and I agree, but they wouldn't win as comfortably and as easily as they do now, which I suppose is the big problem. The fact that Hamilton is winning championships with 4 or 5 races to spare. It's not what we want to see. We don't want to see the sport rack up to Brazil this year, and we know who the champion is, we know who the constructors champion is, because really that's not what the sport is about. And really we want to see it go to the final day, because nothing in sport quite compares to a title deciding race at the end of a long F1 season. So this sprint race idea, it looks like it's going to happen. I think it could have ramifications for the format for races in 2022 and beyond. So I think this is going to be a huge storyline, and those 3 races are going to be very important for this year and potentially title deciding. So I think that wraps it up. I think they're the 5 big storylines. They're the big things that we'll be keeping an eye on this show, and hopefully we'll have an exciting and entertaining 2021 season. 2020 lived up to our expectations and then some, and hopefully 2021 can continue that trend and we can have an exciting 2021 season. And until then, I'll be back again maybe after Bahrain. I don't have a set schedule, but I will be back again at some stage with episode 2.